Hi, my name is Bibi Siva, and today I'll be talking about place and social affiliation as observed during the Summerland Fire. The objective for this presentation is to discuss the human behaviors and fires observed during the Summerland Fire, particularly behavior known as place and social affiliation. We will also discuss design and emergency planning recommendations that could be made when taking place and social affiliation into consideration. Let's begin with a quick description of the Summerland Leisure Center as well as the fire that occurred that night. Built in 1971, the Summerland Leisure Center was billed as one of the biggest and most innovative indoor entertainment center in the world. On the night of August 2nd, 1973, a fire started at the center, which later became known as the Summerland Fire. This fire is also referred to as the Marquis Showbar Fire in some literatures. The ensuing tragedy was one of Britain's worst fires at the time. It was comparable in magnitude to the 1985 Bradford City Stadium, the 1987 King Cross Fire, as well as the most recent 2017 Grenfell Tower. The fire resulted in 51 casualties. It can be said that several aspects of fire safety failed that night. Some of these aspects include delayed evacuation, delayed notification to the fire department. It has been reported that the fire department was not notified until 20 minutes after the fire started, and even then, notification came from a nearby taxi driver and a ship that was 2 miles off the shore. Flawed facility design with regards to material selection is another failure. A combustible material called oroglass was used throughout the facility, and it was reported that this material was melting and landing on the occupants as they were trying to evacuate in the fire. Lack of staff training is another fire safety aspect that seemed to have failed that night. One of the reasons behind delayed notification to the fire department was that none of the staff took the initiative to call the fire department. It seemed they were not aware of their roles. The actual fire alarm within the building was not activated throughout the fire either, because it was reported that no one felt it was their role, their job to perform. So staff training was definitely failed that night. What is the most significant failure? If you ask me, I would say it's the lack of design consideration with regards to human behaviors in fires. Having said that, it is beneficial for us to analyze the human behaviors that were observed during the Summerland Fire. Many behaviors were observed, behaviors such as conformity and avoidance. Many of the guests listened to microphone announcements coming from the solarium stage, instructed them to stay seated and remain calm because the fire was a small fire. Two of the more prominent observed behaviors during the fire were place affiliation and social affiliation. Let's discuss place affiliation. It is widely understood that in an emergency, a person is more likely to evacuate through the entrance that they previously used because they are familiar with it and they believe it will lead them to safety. Using an unknown door may pose new risk which the evacuee may not be willing to take during the emergency. This behavior is known as place affiliation. Place affiliation is a well-known human behavior in fire that has been recognized by many experts in the field of fire safety. I'll go over some of the quotes. The Society of Fire Protection Engineers states, people are likely to use the main exit, i.e. the exit with which they are most comfortable with for evacuation. Sim, in his report in 1984, stated that in an emergency, people are even more likely to be drawn towards the familiar than under normal circumstances. In his 2001 paper, Prowl, stated that people are very unlikely to be prepared to try an unknown route during an emergency. Given that the Summerland Leisure Center was a tourist getaway, a majority of its guests were visitors who may not have been familiar with the facility or its emergency routes and procedures. Hence, it is not surprising that place affiliation behavior was exhibited by several of the guests. As stated, several guests exited through the doors that they were most familiar with. It was reported that many of the guests made their way back to the main doors and the glass doors beside it. The role played by lack of familiarity with the center can be seen in the difference of exit choices between the guests and the staff. One would assume that the staff would be more familiar with the center than the guests. A higher percentage of the guests compared with the staff retraced their step back to the main entrance and the glass doors, hence proving the point that familiarity does play a role in our choices to evacuate. As stated earlier, place affiliation is a well-known behavior, and as such, many experiments and research papers have been written about this behavior. The Summerland Fire was a driver behind one of these experiments that involved virtual reality. This experiment consisted of participants walking to a virtual museum through a familiar door. The participants were then asked to evacuate when a fire alarm sounded. The museum consisted of two exit doors, the familiar door, which they came in, and an unfamiliar door. The experiment also introduced a virtual neighbor in order to determine if these had impact on the participants' exit choice. This could tie into further study into conformity or social affiliation as well. The experiment reinforced the hypothesis associated with place affiliation, that in an emergency situation, a person is more likely to go through the familiar exit. It was observed that nearly 62% of the participants exited through the familiar door. The IKEA experiment is another research based on place affiliation. A series of evacuation drills were conducted at the stores, and the participants were non-informed customers. The study concluded that the customers attempted to exit the stores either by the main entrance or by following IKEA's trademark walk-through exit, which takes you through the entire store. Customers seldom used any emergency exits. This further strengthens the belief that people are more likely to exit through the familiar place. Thanks to the ever-increasing body of knowledge gained through experimentation and research, it can be argued that we now have a better understanding of this phenomenon called place affiliation. As such, designs of leisure complexes and other buildings really should incorporate what we know now about place affiliation when designing new facilities, as well as designing new emergency evacuation plans. The following recommendations are made in an effort to reduce the risk associated with place affiliation. Where possible, install windows on egress doors that lead directly to the outside. People may be more likely to take an unknown route and use an egress door if they can see that it leads them directly to safety. Train staff to direct evacuations through nearby exits. As discussed earlier, a person is less likely to take an unknown exit in a fire emergency. However, if staff members were to guide a few of the guests through unfamiliar exits, other guests would be more likely to follow. This human behavior is known as conformity. This behavior was observed during the virtual museum experiment, which concluded that participants use a familiar door increased when the virtual neighbor also used the door, and decreased when the virtual neighbor used the unfamiliar door. While convincing the first few guests to take the unknown exit may seem like a challenge, one of the behavior observed during fires is that some people will look for leaders. They will look for figures of authority to follow. Hence, if a trained staff, and not only trained, but if the staff is also clearly identified as staff, it'll be more likely to get people to follow them. Ensure that fire exits and egress routes are well identified. It had been reported that several exit signs were fairly indistinguishable. Use internationally recognized images and symbol and signage instead of wording. This would eliminate any issues regarding language barriers. Let us now talk about social affiliation. At the time of the fire, the Summerland Leisure Center was largely filled with family and friends on vacation. It has been reported that during the evacuation, several people were seen traveling against the flow of escaping people in an attempt to reach their children. This behavior can be attributed to social affiliation. The following is an excerpt from the SFP Handbook for Fire Protection Engineering. The handbook states that the nature of a relationship between the occupant and the surrounding population will influence the manner in which information is perceived and the action is subsequently performed. It will influence the responsibility felt by an occupant for those around them, information exchanged, perceived risk, and the preparatory actions that might be performed before movement to safety is initiated. Social affiliation during the fire. Social affiliation impacted evacuation in two ways: how the occupants interpreted the fire cues and how the occupants responded to the fire cues once they interpreted them to be valid. Looking into how interpretation of the fire cue was by the occupant was impacted, Sim stated in his paper that individuals separated from group members, especially if alone, were more likely to have responded to ambiguous than unambiguous cues. It could be said that separated individuals interpreted the cues quicker out of concern for their loved ones. Now, how the occupants responded to the fire cue was also impacted by social affiliation. As mentioned earlier, parents were seen traveling against the flow of escaping people to reach their children, putting their children's safety first. So instead of choosing to evacuate, they went into the danger to make sure that children were safe. Similar to place affiliation, social affiliation is also a well-known human behavior in fire, and has also led to several research papers and experiments. One of these experiments was conducted by Prowl and Fahey in 1999, and in their research paper, they reviewed the findings from 5 evacuation studies. Although social affiliation was not mentioned by name, it is clearly visible when comparing evacuation findings between office buildings, and residential buildings. Their research concluded that a major difference between the two occupancies is that in office buildings, occupants are usually not responsible for others. All occupants are capable adults, so each person has to essentially take care of him or herself. The situation is entirely different in residential buildings. A long time will be spent gathering family members before starting to evacuate together, and time may also be invested in looking for friends and neighbors who may need assistance. So, in their conclusion, social affiliation is clearly visible. I mentioned previously that social behavior is a well-known phenomenon, and several experiments and research has been conducted to better understand this behavior. The question is, has this led to any changes. The answer is yes. One of the changes that resulted from the Summerland Fire was an update to a British regulatory document. The Guide to Fire Precautions in Existing Places of Entertainment and Like Premises introduced some new guidelines that would mitigate the risk associated with having children separated from their parents. Here are some of the changes that were made and recommendations that were introduced into the regulation. If implemented, recommendations previously mentioned will do a great job at minimizing the risks associated with parents searching for their children during fires. However, we can further enhance these recommendations by taking advantage of the technology we have today. I will now be going over some recommendations that I feel would benefit us today. Places which look after infants or toddlers should have a system in place to notify the parent that the child has been safely evacuated. A simple way to do this would be to have the parent leave their cell phone number with them and send out messages or phone calls to the parents when the child has been safely evacuated. Another method would involve a pager-like system, similar to the one you get when you go to restaurants, where once your child has been evacuated, then they could just page the parent so the parent would know not to go look for their children. Another recommendation is facilities should utilize assembly areas where possible and guide evacuees towards the nearest assembly area. Each assembly area should have a staff that would remind evacuees to contact any other members of the group they were separated from and let them know that they're safe. This could prevent people from wasting their time looking for a group member before evacuating themselves. Staff could also be given radios at each assembly areas in order to communicate, so they can search for other group members and communicate that way as well. To successfully implement any of these recommendations, it is crucial that the parents be made aware of this evacuation plan. Therefore, the facility should have a way to effectively present their emergency evacuation plan to the parent. One possibility would be to ensure that the parent completes an online information package detailing the plan prior to dropping off their child. Another option would be to have the staff inform the parent of the emergency plan when they are dropping off the children. It must be noted that the above mentioned recommendations are not foolproof. They heavily rely on the parent checking their phones during the fire emergency or reacting to the pager going off. I'd like to conclude this presentation with a few points now. The growing field of human behavior in fire is still very much underappreciated and growing. Human behavior in fires must be better understood and considered when designing facilities or emergency evacuation plan in order to minimize the occupants' risk and reduce the number of fatalities in a fire. Several recommendations could be made to mitigate the risk associated with place affiliation. However, the key focus of the recommendation should be to increase the occupants' familiarity with the emergency evacuation plan and the alternate fire exit, as well as the facilities that they are visiting. Social affiliation could both be a negative and positive. When separate from a group, it could cause a person to react quicker to an ambiguous cue, but it could also cause the same person to travel towards the fire to ensure the safety of a loved one. The Summerland Leisure Center was designed to be a state-of-the-art family entertainment resort. Unfortunately, the group of patrons, families, to which the center catered towards happened to be highly susceptible to both place and social affiliation. Looking back at the Summerland Leisure Center fire, it is not hard to argue that the concept of place and social affiliation were were not given the consideration they required when designing the facility. Thank you.